Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie, welcoming today Dr. Susanne Schmeier in a little bit to talk to us about the global water crisis, which I've become increasingly interested and passionate about after experiencing a drought where I was upstate this summer. And after looking more into it, I'm so excited we're going to be talking about this today. But Nick, before we do, considering some of your work on Twitter and your recent comments about the war and the impact on civilians in war in Ukraine and the advances that we're all hearing about Ukraine. So I was at a farmer's market this weekend and I was getting fist bumps from some of the people saying, go Ukraine, you can do it. And I thought, well, that's great. I don't really represent Ukraine, but somehow, some way, at a very doorstep level, the advances being made in Ukraine are exciting people after kind of a summer where Ukraine wasn't in the news. So can you kind of tell us in a short form, what are the latest developments? What are you seeing? And I loved your questions to Putin about what's happening in Russia and what are you seeing? How did this happen?
Well, in short, and this brings it back to the doorstep and the fist bumps at farmers markets, is after weeks of hearing about all of this Western aid going to Ukraine, people are seeing the results of that, which is not simply that Ukraine is hanging on by its fingernails, but in fact has been able to retake territory that was lost after the Russian invasion in February. So I think for many people, this seemed to validate why Ukraine should be supported, because you're seeing results. But the question now moving forward, we actually have several questions. One is, can Ukraine sustain this? Can it do it in other parts of the country? We're going to have Dr. Schmeier on talking about water. And of course, one issue in Ukraine's south is control of the water resources that feed into Crimea, and whether or not we'll see a Ukrainian advance there as well. So can Ukraine sustain this in a way that would change the tenor and balance of the war? Inside of Russia, this is bringing up doorstep questions there, because yes, sanctions have been imposed on Russia, but the Kremlin was very careful to really ensure that the invasion of Ukraine was being done by a relatively small number of forces, and local Donbas militias, mercenaries, an overwhelming number of the Russian regular forces drawn from the more peripheral parts of Russia, of the Russian Federation, and that you didn't want to have a situation where a lot of people in Moscow and St. Petersburg and Voronezh and Rostov suddenly have their sons and daughters being drafted and sent to Ukraine. But what we have just seen over the last week calls into question whether Russia can sustain its invasion with a relatively light footprint, and what will be the doorstep impacts there. And then finally, the third set of doorstep impacts is, can Ukraine get this done before the inevitable economic, financial, and energy crisis engulfs Europe this winter? At some point, European euros that have been going to support Ukraine are going to be diverted to prop up subsidies for domestic energy prices in Europe. And so at some point, the West's ability to keep supporting Ukraine may flag. And so the Russians may be waiting to see whether or not this produces either pressure for a negotiated settlement or that Ukraine can't sustain its forward momentum. So a lot is in play. And then, of course, some other recent developments that tie into all of this, the resumption of fighting in the Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, continued problems in Libya, and all of this calling into question whether or not energy for Europe from alternative sources other than Russia is necessarily going to flow to market. So a lot of things in play at this point.
And energy scarcity and water scarcity is something that is really important. And let's go to Dr. Schmeier to talk about water now. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schmeier, for joining us today at the Carnegie Council podcast. This is the first podcast of our season 3, and we're starting with a really important topic, water and the global water crisis. I think that I was really struck by a quote from a recent piece that you put out. In light of various crises the world is facing, water typically doesn't make it high on the agenda. I think you're right. You know, we see headlines when drought happens, or Pakistan flooding, or we're asked to conserve water if something happens in our local area. And then it goes away because we think that we see water everywhere. I'm here in New York City next to the Hudson River, and I think, wow, that's a great river. It looks fine to me. But in fact, you know, maybe we can frame this discussion that indeed, though 70% of the world is covered by water, that is only 3% of the water is fresh water. And that is the problem. And so I wonder if you could help us frame that discrepancy between the water that we see and the water that we use.
Yes, that's indeed a good observation. We do see a lot of water. 70% of our planet is water, but as you said, only 3% is fresh water. But out of these 3%, 2/3 of that are actually stored in glaciers or ice caps of the planet. So what's available for human use in rivers, in lakes, in groundwater is even less. And then on top of that, this very little water that is actually available for human use is distributed very unevenly across the planet, right? There are regions, you mentioned New York, I'm based in the Netherlands, where we're usually known, not the last summer, but we're usually known for having a lot of water. There are other regions, arid, semi-arid regions, think about the Middle East, think of the Sahel, parts of Central Asia, where there's significantly less water available. And on top of that, the water that is available is often polluted to an extent that cannot be used by people directly, and they might not have the treatment facilities available to actually access clean water. And if we compare that relatively limited supply of water and the uneven distribution around the world with the growing needs that people have because of populations growing in large or most parts of the world, but also the economy developing, industries growing, and our demand ever increasing, that of course creates a mismatch that has been happening for a long time already, but that with climate change these days gets increasingly worrisome.
I wanted to also throw out there, because you mentioned climate change and everybody talks about carbon footprint. My carbon footprint is this, or, you know, here in the US, of course, the press this summer was, oh, these celebrities say they're environmentalists, but their carbon footprint, they take these private planes. But nobody ever talks about, and I'd like to, in view of your comments on scarcity, talk about the water footprint. You mentioned some of the things that we do to create that footprint, that our uses of water, and to bring it home to the doorstep, which is what we try to do to the average person and in their home. What is our water footprint, and how is the scarcity you're talking about can be maintained or contained by our water footprint?
Our water footprint is indeed something that's quite important and that we should all be thinking about, and we do have methods to actually calculate this water footprint. And just to give you an example, when we talk about food, when we talk about what we eat every day, you can imagine that growing food that we directly consume, plants, of course, has a much lower water footprint than if we grow plants first, we feed cattle with it, and ultimately we end up eating the meat in a burger, for example. So eating meat, but also the clothes we wear, everything that we use in terms of industrial produced goods is something where water goes into that we typically don't see. And then on top of that, I think it's important to also think about virtual water trade. What we mean by that in the water community is water that leaves the area where it originally came from through exported goods such as food, right? Think about grapes, for example, that are grown in South Africa and that are being exported to Europe, although South Africa is much more water scarce than a lot of parts of Europe. Or think about avocados, also quite water intensive vegetable that is grown often in water scarce areas, Central, South America, even Israel, and that we consume in North America or in Europe. So thinking about how much water is in what we eat, what we wear, what we consume, what we use in our everyday lives is definitely a step that everyone can take and think about how to reduce their water footprint and ultimately their water consumption and have their small little contribution to improving the world's water situation.
When we talk about the virtual water trade, I think that's really important to think about where water is scarce and is not scarce, because that, I think, and that discrepancy is the problem that is going to lead. In your research, you talk a lot about at the Water, Peace, and Security Partnership about this conflict, because of the discrepancy. And I'd like to also touch on that and then touch on your definition of water diplomacy, because I know you were mentioning that some journalists are not using that term correctly, so that maybe we can take this to a global perspective and understand the discrepancies in the water supply and this carbon footprint and water footprint is really so interesting to me, because I think that will help people really understand where and how their usage is impacting water in another region entirely.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to add, I think things are quite complex here, right? So we have a water footprint, and the immediate idea that we as consumers would probably have is we should be buying products from regions where there is no water scarcity that would help the overall water crisis. However, then we should not forget that a lot of regions depend highly on the export, right? Think about cotton exported from Uzbekistan, for example. It's not a country where one should necessarily grow something as water intensive as cotton, given the water scarcity in the region. But then if you look at the contribution it has to the GDP of the country and how many people depend on it in terms of jobs, income, livelihoods, and so on, things get a little bit more complicated. So I think in the long run, it's about adapting to the respective water situation, but in the short run, also keeping these complexities in mind and helping maybe countries also to adapt to crops that are more suitable for their respective water situation.
So that trade-off is an interesting question. What can we do, and what are the trade-offs, and what are the ethical trade-offs? Since we're the Carnegie Council for Ethics, what are some of the trade-offs that we should consider? So that's one of them, the fact that scarce regions may be producing something that we need. Other trade-offs you can think of that we need to be thinking about from an ethical perspective.
I can think of many. I'm thinking what would be a good example. I think a question that for me is also relating to ethics a lot is the conflict that can potentially be caused by water insecurity and by drought, and by really taking water into the picture when we look at conflict, right? I'm thinking of the Sahel, for example, where we often hear in the news about illicit groups, terrorist groups, Boko Haram, local conflict in the inner Niger Delta in Mali, for example. But I think what people tend to forget is that there's quite a big water component in that, not in the simple sense that water scarcity leads to conflict and leads to violence automatically, but in the sense that because there is less water available, or quite often also because water is available at different or shorter periods during the year, conflict emerges between different water users, farmers and herders, for example, that in previous years, when the time when water was available was longer, did not enter into direct conflict over cropland and pasture land, but does now. But also indirectly, these people then having reduced livelihoods, right? Being able to grow less food or being able to have less cattle that can graze, which deprives them of their livelihoods and then might push them to join illicit groups, terrorist groups, simply because there is a lack of livelihood opportunities. And I think when we talk about conflict, and that for me is also a question that relates to ethics and how we look at these conflicts, but also how we look, for example, at the refugees that often come from these conflict affected regions and just have to make their way elsewhere. When we look at that, I think we definitely need to keep the water dimension in mind as well.
I think that that's very important, because as Tatiana started the conversation, water doesn't always seem to be on a top list of concerns particularly for national security. But then when you start digging, you find that in many cases, conflicts have a water dimension. Either the problem is that water is not in a particular place and that place needs to get it, or the people move to find the water. You mentioned Uzbekistan and the cotton industry. It was different when the Soviet Union existed and the Soviet Union could divert water, but now Uzbekistan's water lies not in its own country, but in other countries that may say, we don't choose to share it with you, or we're going to charge a price. We see it with how many conflicts, Crimea, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has a water dimension for controlling water access to Crimea, the conflicts in the Middle East, China's conflicts with India and other states in Southeast Asia about control of access to the sources of water. We almost had a war between Egypt and Ethiopia over the dams on the Nile. Could you perhaps talk a bit more about water diplomacy then, and water? I mean, this idea of water, peace, and security. The notion that really the question of access to water, control of water, is a driving factor in whether or not we see peace or conflict in any particular region of the world.
Mm-hmm. Let me start with water diplomacy, and in that context with relations between states, so really international relations over water. Water diplomacy is an approach, or is the tool that countries, but also international organizations and other actors use in order to ensure that countries that might be in competition over water, you mentioned Egypt and Ethiopia over the Nile, for example, that those engage in peaceful conflict resolution or even in conflict prevention instead of engaging in conflict or even violence. And we see that, we see the conflicts around the world. You mentioned some, you could add to those also Afghanistan, Iran, for example. You could add the Mekong, even the lower Mekong without China. There have been conflicts between Laos building dams and Vietnam and Cambodia downstream. So we have these competitive situations. But if we look at the transboundary watercourses around the world, there are more than 310. In most of them, we actually see much more cooperation, right? Think about the Rhine, the Danube, the Great Lakes between the US and Canada, the Okavango River in Southern Africa, and many, many more. And why is that the case? It's because water diplomacy is employed, and water diplomacy is being employed because countries have acknowledged that engaging in conflict with the neighboring state has too many negative effects, has too many costs on their bilateral or regional relations, on trade relations, on cultural exchange, economic exchange, financial exchange, whatever it might be that links them. So water diplomacy is a tool employed by water, but also by foreign policymakers in order to ensure that this, even if there are tension, that they're contained in a way that allows them to peacefully settle their disputes. And that at the transboundary, at the international level, typically works, right? Even you mentioned Ethiopia and Egypt. Yes, it escalated to an extent that it has not in other basins, but still we haven't seen war. That is quite different though if we look at the more local subnational level, where we do see conflicts. I mentioned the ones between farmers and herders in Mali before, but we see similar conflicts in the Horn of Africa. We've seen tensions, conflicts, violent protests over water in Iran and in Iraq and other places. And there we indeed see more violence than at the interstate level. Of course, not only because of water, but also because of a lack of effective governance mechanisms, effective dispute resolution mechanisms, sometimes even the entire absence of a state. Think of large areas of the Sahel where the state, the government is practically not present and has had to leave large areas to these illicit terrorist, whatever you want to call them, groups. And then there is no means available, similar to water diplomacy at the international level, that would help the different water users to address their conflicts peacefully. And that's where we then see occasional violence, still keeping in mind that overall, worldwide, we do see much, much more cooperation than conflict at all levels, from the individual, interpersonal, communal, all the way to the international, simply because we're so linked to each other through the water that we share, that in most cases, it forces us to cooperate. And that's then, again, water diplomacy.
Which sounds great, but I do think that, going back to your comment that it does fall off the, big picture agenda. And I think that is a concern. And that's why we wanted to very much to speak to you and to highlight this. So the thing that got me was that by 2025, 2/3 of the world's population may face water shortages. And I thought, gosh, that's right around the corner. I mean, we're almost at 2023, and I don't think people are speaking enough about this idea of water shortage. So currently, yes, there may be haves and have-nots in that we've been talking about today, certain areas that are under more stress than others. But I think indeed that this statistic makes it clear that every region of the world is going to face this problem. And I wonder, what can regions that might not be feeling it yet do proactively today to avert a further crisis or shortage, given that these positives that you mentioned, that there are institutions that do work to conserve efforts, or and make sure we cooperate well. Is there anything more that we can do proactively to avert further shortages?
Absolutely. And I agree with you that that's definitely needed, because the trend that we're seeing, in spite of the positive news that I mentioned, the trend that we're seeing is quite negative, right? There are estimates, if we go not only to 2025, but maybe 2050, there are estimates by the UN that say up to 8 billion people could then be affected by water scarcity, at least for 1 month a year. There are other estimates that say by 2030, so not that long, there might be around 700 million people displaced because of water scarcity. So that will, of course, also have its effects, its repercussions on even countries that might themselves not yet face such crisis. So in any case, countries should prepare, whether they'll be affected directly or indirectly. And the ones maybe affected less or more indirectly, such as European ones or parts of North America, can then help other countries to adapt. And I would say we can look at it in 2 times 2 dimensions. We have to address the supply and the demand side, and we have to address the more technical side, including the finances that we need for that, and the governance side. When we think about the supply side, there's relatively little that we can do, given that the overall amount of water that's available is limited. Of course, we can speak about desalination, but that is only an option for very small places and for very small use, given the huge amount of energy that we need for this technology. But what we can do on the supply side is protecting our watersheds, protecting our ecosystems from land degradation, from erosion, from pollution that would negatively affect the availability of the water that is there. But then the demand side is where we can actually do much more, right? If we think how much water is being used where. Agriculture, for example, is the biggest consumer of water worldwide. It's 70% in global average, but if we think about areas such as Iraq, Iran, the broader Middle East, their agriculture consumes more than 90% of the water. So very water scarce region with agriculture consuming way more water than in the global average. So clearly here, something needs to be done and something can be done in terms of adapting crops, but obviously also in terms of irrigation technology, increasing efficiency. Water loss reduction is something. There are places like Tehran, for example, where we know that up to 1/3 of the water in the cities that's used for urban water supply is lost in pipes because of leakages, because of the poor maintenance of the system, partly, of course, also related to the sanctions, but not only. So that's what we can do on the demand side. And then if we look at the technical versus the governance side, there are a lot of technical solutions available. I mentioned more efficient irrigation technology, wastewater treatment, recharging aquifers, using treated wastewater in agriculture, and so on. But this technology, where we've seen a lot of advances in the last years, also needs to be made available. And typically the countries that suffer the most from water scarcity already, or will in the future because of climate change, are the countries that have very limited access to technology and not the financial resources available to actually access that. And that's something that all countries, also the global north, the international community together can tackle. And that's definitely something that needs to be done. But then also looking at the governance side, it's hardly ever water itself that is the problem, but it is really how water is being managed, how water is governed, whether there is an effective legal framework and an effective policy framework for managing water resources, whether such framework ensures equity or disadvantages certain groups that might then hold grievances and maybe protest, which could lead to insecurity. All that needs to be addressed, and institutions need to be strengthened. What we know from research coming out of Oregon State University is that water tends to only lead to conflict if the institutions that exist, the government, from the local to the national to the international level, if these institutions are not resilient or are not adapted enough to deal with water-related change. If we have well-functioning institutions that can, for example, in times of drought, provide support to people, can provide support to farmers to overcome a certain drought period, or can provide the support, the capacity building as well, to invest into new irrigation technologies, or to change crops from the cotton that we mentioned earlier for Uzbekistan to some less water intensive crop, then countries and individual people find it much easier to adapt to the new situation that we'll all be facing. But of course, implementing all of that has been a challenge and remains a challenge, and will probably be even more challenging in the future, given that the pressures are increasing.
Yeah, your comment that the global north needs to take the lead. I don't know, Nick, we've been talking a lot about the pandemic and how the global north failed to serve with technology and with access and everything you're saying. And so I'm wondering if you see, in your research and your work and your context, that in fact, because of the pandemic, lessons were learned on how to transfer technology, on how, if any event happened that showed the connectedness of the world and how the haves need to help those who don't, it would be that. And I'm wondering if you saw any movement or change in especially in the research that you're doing, the work that you're leading on the Water, Peace and Security Project.
Yeah, I would totally agree that the pandemic really should have shown us how things need to be done differently, and how the haves help or need to help the not haves. But in the field of water, I'm not so optimistic there. I think we've rather seen the opposite. As the pandemic hit, countries of the north have been very concerned about their own financial resources. Development aid has decreased to some extent, or has been diverted into pandemic-specific aid, which of course was very, very much needed, right? But has distracted attention from other crises, especially these slow onset crises such as water. So while I would totally agree with your observation that the global north has to do more, and that the pandemic has shown why and how that's needed, I'm not really seeing positive effects in the water sector yet.
So we have, I mentioned before we started taping, the United Nations descending upon New York City, starting on the 18th. Since we're talking about, what lessons have been learned, what institutions worked and didn't work, addressing a global issue, and clearly water is a global crisis. We're all interconnected. Have you worked with, is there somebody we can look to on this multinational, multi-governmental level, such as the United Nations, that has been more effective in spreading the word out? There is so much information on this topic on the internet, and yet somehow that is not translating into news stories or policy pronouncements from policymakers that I've seen. So can we look to the United Nations to lead on this as we look forward? And also, what should we be following if it's not the United Nations? Do you have recommendations for our audience on how to get more information on this issue? Who should they be following? Is there a Greta Thunberg of water?
No, unfortunately, there's not. Although you would think given how connected water and climate are, and given that the climate crisis is actually a water crisis, if you think drought and flood, there should probably one. But I think the United Nations are definitely one key actor there that does play an important role, and that should play a probably even more important role, right? I mean, there are many UN agencies that deal with water, that deal with drinking water supply and sanitation support. Think of UNICEF. There are others that deal with the more environmental dimension of water, UN Environment Program, and others. But that's, of course, also a little bit of a challenge, because there's no single entity, no single UN organization that would be in charge of water. It's spread over more than 10 different UN agencies. So that, of course, creates some need for coordination, let me put it that way. But I think the UN has definitely acknowledged the challenge and is engaging much more. In 2023, so next year in March, there's going to be the big 2023 UN Water Conference, as it's called, co-led by Tajikistan and the Netherlands, together with the UN organizations in charge of water. They'll be gathering in New York end of March next year to discuss what progress has been made when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals and water, and especially SDG 6 with its different dimensions on water supply, sanitation, water resources management, and so on. And we'll hopefully also develop recommendations, but also gather real commitments from states. And I would say that's about time, because the last big water conference the world has seen was in 1977. So
Really?
Yes, yes. So we as the water community tend to take a lot of time, too much time, definitely, to gather regularly and to move the topic ahead. But I really hope that the UN Water Conference next March is going to be a big push and will provide incentives for countries, even the ones that have been reluctant so far, to really engage in alleviating the water crisis, for them to commit in terms of better managing their water resources, but also better cooperating with their neighbors over the rivers, the lakes, and the aquifers that they share.
That's really wonderful. I'm looking forward to hearing more what happens next week here in New York at the UN. But I want to know, and for our audience here, which is very US based, what more can the US do? I feel like, we haven't really focused on the United States, and you talk about technology and you talk about finances, and is the United States the leader in water technology and financial investment? Is it someone else? And what more can we do here?
I think the US does play an important role when it comes to developing technology, but the leader in water technology, or one of the leaders, is definitely Israel, simply because of their own situation and the need to adapt to living in a very water scarce environment. But a lot of technology is coming from the US, and I think the US can play a role in sharing this technology. The US also is an important, not the important, but an important donor when it comes to supporting water services, water protection, water management around the world. I think definitely much more can be done there. There are countries such as the Netherlands that are way smaller, that are more engaged. So maybe that is a call for the US audience to push their policymakers to engage more in that context. But I think as we started our conversation with, everyone individually can think about what water is in the products they consume, and how they can maybe change their lifestyle or their consumption patterns. But also, I mean, it's not that the US is not facing its own water crisis. I think if we look at the west of the US, if we look at California, if we look at the Colorado River, the Rio Grande, and others, we do see that there's a huge water crisis as well. So I think there's also a lot for the US to do domestically, but maybe also then share the lessons that are being learned, that are being developed in addressing the Southwest US water crisis with the rest of the world and the countries that are more in need.
And as we enter our midterm elections, I certainly hope I hear more about water, and we'll certainly continue to talk about it here at the Doorstep. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.